splitting into two societies, one black, one white. Jack Newfield wrote that Bobby was the last presidential candidate who could unite white working-class blue-collar people, something that Frank Barbaro was on the edge of. White working-class blue-collar people and working-class black citizens. They both could identify with him. And recently, Ted Kennedy and Jesse Jackson have been somewhat able to achieve this. The importance of this should not go unrecognized when violent death-threatening attacks take place between working-class white and black who have more in common than they realize. And who benefits is something people should ask themselves by that. Then the Kerner Report came out with the same conclusion as Robert Kennedy. The U.S. was becoming two separate societies, one black, one white, with their own set of laws for survival. I realized that I wanted to help build a bridge, to help bind the American community, the American soul, so that we could mend the broken pieces and have one whole society with respect for its people and respect for its land. In 1971, I began my work in the Bushwick-Williamsburg Black and Latino community, and I've been working there ever since. I worked from 1971 to 1972 as a social worker with teenagers and their families, though I was barely past my own teens. I also had teenage clubs for which I organized dances and outings and was able to work with them individually. I worked in the community to the wee hours of the morning. In my college years, I, along with many, since toddlers and preschoolers, it's been very rewarding, especially since I became a father 5 months ago to Suzanne Elise. I've been working with children and families to provide a program for children based on the discoveries of stage-to-stage development by Piaget, using developmental play and support for families. Parents are qualified who are working, looking for work, or going to school. And recently I began working with teenage parents, thanks to New York State funding, so there won't be dropouts from school on a basis that is just totally unfair and cruel. I had an incredible experience yesterday, which kind of focused for me that what I'm doing today here is important, because I've shifted my whole life because of my 60s experiences. I would have been a lawyer, I would have been active in politics, but I felt that you have to work on a grassroots level when the nation was split into pieces. And yesterday I placed a child in a family daycare home, and I realized as I was talking to the mother that I had known her as a daycare child. And it was shocking, and the years came flooding through me. And I remembered her as a 6-year-old. And we hugged, and she couldn't remember me, but she said something that was just so beautiful. She said, "I can't remember as I described what I looked like back then, but I can remember your voice," and it was a kindly voice. And seeing her as a child, that really meant a lot to me. And then I went downstairs, and a housing truck came by. This was in a housing project in Williamsburg. And two of the people stopped, and both of them I've seen recently, and one of them stopped and said to these two brothers, one said, "Your name is Richard, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes," and the other said, "Jesus." And I remembered something that I was going to talk to here that I was a little, it's so long ago. And I remembered that my first nickname in the community was Jesus. And I remembered, and I realized finally what it really meant. And it was that I lived with people, I drank with people, I smoked with people. I was anti-heroin and spoke about that, but I was non-judgmental. And at a certain point, I no longer drank, and I no longer smoked. I saw death before me, and in the face of death, I realized that for myself, I could not, in our society, even think of indulging in something for positive reasons when there's so much abuse of it in a society that doesn't understand, that just swallows everything up, whether it's vegetables or whether it's trees or whether it's, we're just a Baroque society in a certain level. And witnessing death, I moved away from that. But still, I lived a life that was non-judgmental, and it all came back, and my early youth was before me. And I want to share with you a couple of anecdotes from that period so you can get a sense of what I was trying to do. There was a young woman who was in high school, and this is about 1970, and I was just out of college myself. And she came to me. She was in one of my clubs, the Latin Dolls. I had groups, the Latin Dolls, the Primettes, the Mad Hammers, the Destinations. Some of these groups were also singing groups, and I tried to help them to get music contracts. And Josephine Rodriguez came to me one day and said, I can't take school anymore. And she was in high school. She was Clara Barton High School. And she was thinking of becoming a secretary. And she said, the dean called me a whore. And she said, I'm on drugs. And the first thing I did with some consultation was I took her to a doctor, and they did tests on her. And of course the tests came out negative. And then I confronted the principal, something I've wanted to do my whole life. Ironically, now I'm the borough chair of the daycare directors in the union, which is the same union as public school principals. And I confronted this principal, and as a young man, and with their lies, and with the harm they had done to this young woman. And I had arranged for her to be transferred to a school which is called High School Redirections, which still exists. And they would do anything to have her there. But the harm had been done, and she got transferred to High School Redirections, and she graduated with a 90 average. Another thing that I've seen a lot on these streets, I saw a cop get shot. A fellow had robbed a store, and they were people from the store following him up the street, and I was standing between him and wherever, and people were saying, stop him, and he had dropped the money that he had robbed, and they picked it up. That's all they really wanted. But I was confronting myself, and so I tried to stop him. I wouldn't do it now. And I held him for a second. He got by me, and then two cops came running and threw him against the wall, and I stood there with them, trying to block his way. And then one of the cops got him, and another cop pulled out a gun, and he grabbed her gun, and he shot the other cop. And I remember running down in the most surreal sense. It's kind of like an upside-down French Connection. I was running under the L in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, with this guy who was just standing up. But the thing that you should know is he had a bulletproof vest on. This blood that he was spitting up was the blood that was created by the vest hitting his chest. And ironically, I run a program which is family daycare, and people take care of children in their homes. And one day, I couldn't believe I was watching the news, and her son had been killed by decoy cops, by mistake, unknowingly, in the community that he lived in. Because if he had been anywhere else, they could have just thrown the body away, and they could have made up a whole story about him. But Ricky Lewis was a gentle person, and it was a horror of horrors. And we confronted the precinct in that community. I have really seen a lot. In the early 70s, my nickname moved from Jesus to Serpico, I guess because of what I was doing. In the early 80s, I got mistaken for a local activist priest, Father Steve. And along the way, I reconnected with my Jewish roots. One of the nicest things that happened to me after all these years is being recognized by my peers in the child care community as president of the Professional Association of Daycare Directors of New York City. And I'd like to conclude by sharing with you another division in our society, two separate societies, one adult and male, and the other woman and child, mother and child. Only today there are figures that came out by the Federal Health Commissioner. These figures are from yesterday. Infant mortality rates among black infants is twice the rate among white infants. Infant mortality in the United States, even with that, the United States ranks 21st in the world at the infant mortality level, which means we are behind in our infant mortality rates the rest of the industrialized, what we call the civilized world. I think we're even behind South Africa. The United States, incredibly, is behind in prenatal care. Teen pregnancy is mushrooming in the United States, but not in other industrialized societies. Single-parent families are mushrooming only in the United States. The rates of women and children in poverty are mushrooming only in the United States. For the first time in the history of the United States, the group within our society with the highest rate of poverty is our children. In New York City, 60% of all children below the age of 6 spend some time in poverty. A new study by the federal government, the National Academy of Sciences, states that 56% of all female parents are in the workforce, and by the end of this decade, the end of this century, over 70% of all female parents will be in the workforce, and calls for the passage of a National Child Care Act. And we are, at this particular point, it takes both aspects of a family, the leaders, the mother and father, the husband and wife, to make ends meet. How can we live in a society that neglects its children, who are its future, and expect that society to have a future? No wonder children club children with baseball bats, shoot each other with handguns and Uzis, kill themselves with substance abuse. No wonder it's recently been found that 23% of all black males in our society are dead by their early 20s. No wonder the U.S. cannot currently compete with the new great industrial powers, Japan and Germany. I call for the passage of a National Child Care Act so that young children can get an early start in life instead of spending more money on their later incarceration. And maybe we can once again promise a generation more than what we've had instead of less. That's it. Any questions? Well, what you should know is that I'm not a part of the public school system. I made a decision long ago. I couldn't include that in here. I stood in a school in the South Bronx. I had taken a national teacher's license exam, and I was going to be placed in this junior high school. This is back in 1970. And I felt like snakes all over. I said, my God, this school is a prison. I don't belong here. I'm going to work in a community. I'm going to work on another level. And the daycare centers in New York City don't have that problem. Parent involvement is on a first-hand level. The teachers in the classroom who have the same qualifications. I talked a little bit about that before. I don't know if you were here when I mentioned this to Frank Barbaro. They have the same qualifications. They work for longer hours, they get less vacation. They're minority women, so of course they work for lower pay. And of course, males in a female environment, like I am, are also a part of that discrimination in pay. But in our daycare classrooms, the people who are the heads of those classrooms, the teachers, are minority women. The people who take what are called family daycare teacher provider mothers, who take care of infants and toddlers in my program, live in the community and the children are brought to them. My own child is in a family daycare home. So there isn't that question at all. And the materials that I get, and Nick can attest to that, I go to a school, not a school, a store. One exists on the west side and one exists on the east side, called Eeyores. And the west side store is on 79th and Broadway, and the east side store is on Madison and 85th Street. And they have many, many books that represent all cultures and all languages. Since I have a lot of Latino kids, I have books that can be on a first, and since many of the people who care for the Latino kids don't even speak English themselves, the books are reflective in terms of language development, because that's a point where you can really work for bilingual children, and so that they don't lose their own language and become proficient in English and Spanish. And the books themselves, they're great child authors, like a fellow by the name of Keats, that reflect the urban black community that our children are growing up in. And those materials are those books are given out in the family daycare homes. And so we really are a rainbow. And I deal on a first-hand level with parents. It's very different from the school system. This week, one of the mothers of 2 children in my program was operated on for cancer. And I spoke to her before she ever had her children in the program. And she told me that she had to go for hospital care, and that she had a thyroid condition, and she thought she had a tumor, but she didn't focus. And I said, "Are you worried?" And you could hear it in her voice. "Are you worried that you have cancer?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Have you asked your doctors about it?" And she said, "No." So I've been able to help. I hope I've helped before parents are even have their children in the program. Very different from the experience parents have in our public school systems. I hope I've answered your question. I don't think my program's an exception. I've had 19 years of experience, and I've been in, I don't know if you've visited these centers, they exist under tough conditions. There were wonderful daycare programs in the South Bronx, in Bed-Stuy, up in Harlem, in the South Bronx, in St. Albans and Queens. They're wonderful programs that are surviving under very tough conditions, and the people who run those programs have to try to safeguard those programs under tough conditions, because these programs are little oases in a surrounding desert. And the children get better placement in the schools than the street kids would, because they are really, truly moving ahead in reading levels, and there is documentation to back that up. What you should do, I don't know where you live, but I'm sure within neighborhoods, because we have public daycare programs throughout New York City. We need many more. And of course, we keep going from budget crisis to budget crisis. And the mayor who's promised us to be a mayor for Children First and parents, I have to stop for a second and reflect to you. Part of the problem, and I was alluding to it in the fact that we are an anti-child society, is that 3 weeks ago, just as an example, a child was burnt, and that was front page news by another child. But our mayor announced on the steps of City Hall a call for an early childhood commission. And he had great speakers there that day. He had Liz Holtzman, he had Manhattan Borough President Ruth Messenger, he had visionaries in the child care field, he had steps filled with advocates and children, and yet not one newspaper, not one television station would broadcast this positive news of a mayor following the vision that he spoke to in his inaugural address. We are in an anti-childhood society where what seems to be abuse and neglect are front page news, but the things that we are doing for our children are not considered news. I really think that it's because we live in a bully, biased, death-ridden society where the great liberal leaders were snuffed out in the period that I was talking to you about. And young people said to themselves at that time, I am radicalized. And of course, we all were, and called themselves revolutionaries or radicals. But I'll say, to quote Phil Oakes, love me, I'm a liberal. I don't mind saying it. I have no problem saying it. But the thing is that since those assassinations, the United States has changed direction. And what was anathema in the 50s and early 60s, to say I'm a conservative, is like the greatest thing in the world to say today. I mean, it's unbelievable. I couldn't... Everyone laughed at somebody who called himself a conservative. People, unfortunately, laughed at Barry Goldwater, and he won the election. He did win the election. He called himself Lyndon Johnson. And that's where part of the problem is. Lyndon Johnson called himself a liberal, but yet, while he was running for president and showing commercials on television of mushroom clouds and children, blonde-haired children dancing like this in front of the mushroom cloud, he was already planning for a huge increase of U.S. troops in Vietnam. And he was saying that the person who's going to do that to our society, his name is Barry Goldwater. And that crushed, because within 2 years of that, 4 years of that, you have the confrontation that took place at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, a horrible year. And people, I think it has a lot to do with what happened during those 4 years after the Kennedy assassination, with why so many of that generation later voted Republican. They couldn't identify with the Democratic Party, and they couldn't identify with the word liberal. But I have no problem speaking to that. I haven't changed my philosophy. I just hope I've grown as a human being. I have no fear of the word liberal, but a lot of other people want to go whichever way the wind blows. And if the going thing is conservatism, the great middle ground, that's the direction that they'll go in. If they sense a shift, they will just as easily vote Democrat for president. It's pretty amazing. Did I answer your question? Thank you.
Our final speaker today has come from the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. And before he speaks, I just wanted to note that I had spoken to Norman Siegel of the New York Civil Liberties Union, and he spoke to me and he yelled at me. He said, look, Nick, you know, I like what you're doing. I think it's great, but quite frankly, you have all white people on your panel except for one person, Dwayne Hart. Do you know that there's a lot of attacks on Puerto Ricans, there's a lot of attacks on Asians? And I said, well, Norman, I'm new to this. Can you tell me who I can call? I don't have much time and I need to get funding for this. So he said, he mentioned Margaret Fung and also Michael Shen from the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. So I called up Margaret and she was not there. So then I called up Michael, and Michael was more than happy to come to speak to us today. And again, I want to reemphasize that violence or bias against any of us is violence against or bias against all of us. And that if there is a growing group of people who are affected by bias, we have to address that. I just want to see a show of hands of how many people in this room knew that one of the leading groups of people victimized by bias attacks right now are Asian Americans. How many of you knew that? There's about 4 or 5 of you raised your hand. And I think that was a shock to me too. I didn't realize that was happening. And what the roots are, you can certainly study yourself to see what the roots are. I have certain hypotheses myself. Of course, it goes back to the establishment of this country and the perpetuating myth of manifest destiny that George Bush just demonstrated by going into Panama, and all the myths about a white North America. And we can see that in the genocide and mass starvation, reservation group of people called Native Americans. But we also see that in the growing anti-Japanese feeling that it has been statistically shown to be growing in this country. And quite frankly, if our car companies and electronic companies can't produce, why should we be taking it out on people who are of a different nationality than us because they're making better products? And of course that comes down into a broad generalization of Oriental peoples, which is not correct, that there's many cultures and many races within Oriental culture. Michael Shen is, again, from the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, and I'd like to draw your attention to him and thank him for coming today, spending part of his busy day to come speak to us on this issue and educating us so that we can do something about it. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. I'm glad to find out today that I'm a stand-in for Margaret Fung, but here I am anyway. I'm not going to speak too long because, frankly, I'd rather try to get some interaction. I'd like to have a longer period for questions and answers. But I'll give some introductory remarks, and then hopefully we can turn into a discussion. There's really a very rapidly rising tide of anti-Asian violence. The problem began in the early 80s and really came to the fore in around 1985 in a case of Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was a resident of Detroit, and he was killed by an unemployed auto worker who mistook him for Japanese, and he blamed him for his unemployment. Since then, there have been repeated instances of anti-Asian violence throughout the country. In Florida, Texas, and Michigan, there have been acts of violence against Vietnamese fishermen who were competing with the local fishermen. They've been shot at, boats have been burned. Recently, actually, the government has gotten involved in this kind of discrimination out in San Francisco, where Vietnamese fishermen had been prevented from fishing by the resurrection of a statute which does not permit, or which forbids people without U.S. citizenship from having boats of certain size. And because the Vietnamese fishermen they do their fishing further out so that the local fishermen can, they won't compete with the local fishermen, they're being deprived of their ability to make a living out there. The case is pending right now, and I think it's in the the Ninth Circuit right now. Elsewhere throughout the country, in Philadelphia, Hmong refugees have been repeatedly attacked. In Revere, Massachusetts, in 1987, 40 Cambodians were burnt out of their houses because of friction with the locals there. In Washington, D.C. in 1985, there were arson attacks on 9 Korean restaurants. You've probably all read about the Korean difficulties in the black community in Bed-Stuy and in Harlem here. The friction doesn't only occur between the majority society, but it's also occurring within the minority society. In Jersey City, I don't know how many of you are aware of the racial tension, and actually there have been several murders out there against the Indian community. There's a group which calls themselves the Dot Busters, which have attacked out in the open, even in Journal Square in midday. Indian women have been spat on, called names, and one person, Mr. Modi, was attacked, and his skull was smashed by a group of teenagers when he was coming outside of a bar in Hoboken. There have been a series of what are termed Patel attacks. Apparently, some group of people looks through the phone book looking for Indian names and calls them, harassing them, tries to find out their address, and there have been actual attacks on the homes. There have been similar incidents in Queens where egg has been thrown at houses. Recently, well, actually it's about 2 years now, in University of Connecticut, 8 Asian students were going to a dance, and they were going on a school-sponsored bus. In the back of the bus, there were a bunch of athletes who taunted and spat at the Asian students for half an hour. And the description of one of the students there told me that her hair was just totally matted with spittle when she got off the bus. And the school just basically looked the other way. They whitewashed the whole situation. And I think there was a suspension of one of the athletes for a short period of time, but there was really, no action taken against most of the offenders. Recently, there was a case down in North Carolina, Jim Liu, who was killed by 2 brothers, the Pish brothers, who mistook him, he's Chinese, mistook him for a Vietnamese. They said that their brothers and friends had not come home from Vietnam, and goaded them into fighting for about a half an hour in a pool hall. They taunted them and tried to pick a fight.